I'm so encouraged to be here today. I'm a fellow teacher, and teachers are keepers of culture. And if there's a calling that we could answer today, there's none more important than to keep our culture, to pass it on to our students so that they in turn can pass it on to theirs and to the next generation. I want to talk about history today. History is often treated as kind of a mundane thing, just one event after another, with little or no meaning at all. History today, however, is under attack. That is, there are forces who would divide us from our past, and by dividing us from our past would divide us from one another. And I'm often asked when I travel around the country, is there an approach to history which could be a common ground for an increasingly divided society? And I think there is. I want to propose to you what I call the liberal approach to history. And by liberal, I mean the classical meaning of liberal, that is, an education toward freedom. And there are two principles that govern the liberal approach to history. One is history should be observational. And that is, we look at events in all their details, in the fullest context possible. We don't reduce events to something less than what they are. For example, we would not want to adopt any form of the Marxian notion of history that says all history is struggle and all persons are reducible to their class, their race, or their gender. Rather, we want to look at the whole of an event, and we want to look as much as we can at the whole narrative of a society. And that's what history is. It's the study of change in society moving across time. So number one, history is observational. Number two, history should be sympathetic. And there are two meanings to sympathy. One is we move with others in their suffering. That is, we recognize that human beings and the condition that we have suffer, and all kinds of suffering. But in history, we're particularly keen to look at those moments of suffering where either persons rise to courage and do something really great that stands out in the past, or we look at those moments where people impose suffering on others. I call those failings. We might call them moral failings, and they're the kinds of things that catch people's attention, say, well, given those failings, we don't really care about the past, but I think we ought to care about the past. A second meaning of sympathy is that we have a natural affinity for all things human. And then that means in the study of history, we're looking at all kinds of human events, not just the ones that are moments of courage or the moments of oppression, but we're looking at everything that makes life meaningful. To further understand history, let me emphasize a number of major features of history. The first one is maybe the most obvious, that history is constituted by events. But here's the deal. There's an infinite number of events. So how do we discern which events come into our memory, come into our public memory? How do historians actually determine which events make it into our history books? The chief kind of event that makes it into history books and occupies our public memory are what the historian Wilfred McClay calls eruptive events. These were events that break into the normal pattern of time and become meaningful, either because they give us a great source of life or because they break away from our sources of life. Let me give you some examples. Now, this is a river. It's not a very significant river. It's not a very large river. And somebody might confuse it for a creek or a stream. And we wouldn't really remember the river except for something very important, that in 49 BC, Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Now, you might know that there was something like a circular boundary around the city of Rome, and a Roman general could not cross that boundary with his army without breaking the law. And the breaking of the law would translate to a declaration of civil war. That's exactly what Julius Caesar did in 49 BC. He crossed the Rubicon, declared civil war, and of course, became the emperor of Rome. And of course, the rest is history. Adolf Hitler did something similar in 1938. This is a scene from the Anschluss. This is the moment at which Nazi Germany invaded without any kind of resistance Austria and absorbed Austria into the German Empire. World War II, of course, became the most carnal, violent, and deadly war in all of history. This was the infamous day, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt called it, when the Imperial Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. This was the moment that brought America into World War II. This is a map of the carnage in Europe alone. And again, this is the most fatal or violent, deadliest war in all of history. You take all the wars previous to World War II, there were more deaths in that war than all the other ones together. Now, not all eruptive events are violent. Some of them are quite quiet. For example, the discovery of the intellect in ancient Athens. We collectively call this the birth of philosophy. Philosophy, of course, is rooted in two Greek words, philia and sophia, which means love on the one hand and wisdom on the other. In particular, the Greek philosophers discovered what they called the nous. Now, the nous is a word for mind. It's also a word for the divine or the highest. And they thought that the mind was the highest thing in the human person. St. Augustine would later say that the mind makes us in the order of things just below God. The nous is that by which we participate in every level of reality. We're conscious of being material critters, spiritual critters, moral critters, social critters. We also recognize in the birth of the love of wisdom that out of that came formative cultural components that have continued to this day. For example, what we call the liberal arts and sciences were initiated, designed, and named in the ancient Greek world. Out of it too came a habit of living together, working together that we call academies. Your schools are residues of this eruptive event in ancient Greece, in that you are continuing to live the academic life with your students and with each other as faculty members, and you're carrying on the tradition of the liberal arts and sciences. This was an eruptive event, and it exploded into the Western world and gave an unprecedented amount of learning and devotion to all forms of knowledge and wisdom. There was another set of eruptive events in ancient Israel. Collectively, we call it revelation. And out of the events of ancient Israel, both among the Hebrew people, the people of Israel, and then, of course, among the Christian people, we get the habit called the love of God and the love of neighbor. Regarding the love of God, what do we get? We get an outburst of forms of worship. We get an advancement of theology. We had theology in the pagan world, but when you compare Greek theology to the advanced Christian theology that was developed in the West, it's really pretty thin gruel. An enormous outbreak of theological science because of the love of God. We also get an explosion of art from John Damascene forward. John Damascene was the apologist for imagery in churches. And because he defended imagery, the Christian civilization took on the habit of art in an unprecedented way. We get an explosion of art in the Western world as in no other culture in history. We also get an explosion of beautiful architecture. You think about the great cathedrals like Notre Dame. And then we also get a distinction between church and state. That is, a division between authorities. In the ancient Roman and Greek world, there was no division. That is, all things religious and political were under the same house. And even the emperor in ancient Rome was considered to be a god. Not so once the Christian gospel takes hold in medieval Europe. And you get a distinction between two realms of authority. That is, the members of the church hold to a kingdom that is not of the world. And so the authorities of the world don't have a claim on everything about their lives. They have some claim, and even Jesus says as much when he says, render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. But there is that distinction between church and state, and this will shape politics permanently. That is, we permanently hold to things under what we call the private sector. And the number one feature of the private sector is the religious. And we got this because of Revelation, because of that collective set of eruptive events. We also get the love of neighbor, and we get the practice of charity, mercy, and solidarity. In the ancient pagan world, this, by the way, is a painting of it's called Le Bon Samaritain, which means the Good Samaritan. And it's painted by Giordano, who was an Italian painter. In the ancient pagan world, there were poor people. There have always been poor people. There will always be poor people. But poor people were not considered to be inherently dignified. Poor people at best were considered to be rabble and a potential political problem. And so sometimes politicians would pay them off. They would give them favors in order to get them on their side. There was another kind of poor person, that is a widow or an orphan. If a hoplite in Greece or a centurion in Rome fell in battle, then the polis or the empire, respectively, would provide funds or extra grain allotments for the widows and the orphans. But they did not provide grain and funds for the poor because they were poor, only because either they were the remaining family of fallen soldiers or they were a political problem. Only with the advent of the gospel, when Christians collectively organized themselves to serve the poor in pagan Rome, when the Christians had no political power and they had very little wealth, they collectively took care of Christians, Jews, pagans, anybody who suffered from poverty. Julian the Apostate, who was an emperor and was trying to revive pagan religion, looked at this and told his priests, he said, these Christians are taking care of the poor as we've never seen before. We've got to do something. We've got to do something to compete with them. Again, the habit of considering the poor as inherently dignified came from things like the Good Samaritan story. The Samaritan, of course, was an outcast in Jewish society. And Jesus, when he taught the Levite lawyer about how is it you attain eternal life, he taught him to be merciful. And the standard for mercy partly was developed through the story of the Good Samaritan, who, although an outcast, took care of this stranger, this half-dead man who was naked and bloody because he had been attacked by the road between Jerusalem and Jericho. This kind of story and the kind of sayings that Jesus said when he said, unless you feed the hungry and clothe the naked, you do not feed and clothe me. In other words, he identified with the poor. Because of these kinds of things, the concern for the poor as inherently dignified took off. And our concern for the poor has, to this day, been a permanent residue. In fact, in Tudor England, you might remember that Henry VIII went after the monasteries. And among other things, he took the roofs of the monasteries and he removed them so they were uninhabitable, and sent the monks into diaspora. Many of them were actually imprisoned. But what's germane to this point is that the monasteries had been the chief places where the poor of England went for hospital care and for food and for shelter. Once that was lost, there was no place for them to go. Elizabeth I realized that this was a huge social problem, and she instituted the poverty laws of England, which for all intents and purposes was the first germ of the modern welfare state. And I'm saying that because, number one, the poor don't cease to be poor. Someone needs to take care of them, but the habit of taking care of them came to us by way of Christian practice. I mentioned early in my presentation that history is the study of change in society, moving in time. And there are three principal kinds of change. There are eruptive changes, there are subsequent changes since those eruptions, and there are residues around us. Let me give you some examples. I've already talked about eruptive changes. This is a map of England and France from 1066, which you know is the year of the Battle of Hastings and the Normandy Invasion. For all intents and purposes, what we have after William the Conqueror finishes his conquest of England is England as we've known it in the modern world. When I give this map to my students, I say, what do you see geographically? What can you observe? And eventually they get to this observation, that the two countries are very close to each other, and that the thing that's separating them is not that wide. In fact, if It's if you look in the section of France that's colored in gold, to go to the northernmost tip. Now, Calais is not marked on the map, but if you could put your finger on that point where Calais rests, and then you go across the channel to the closest position point, that is the Cliffs of Dover. And it's today it takes about a half hour to cross on a ferry. It takes about a half hour, maybe 40 minutes to cross the channel. So it's a very, very short travel by sea. Between 1066 and the early part of the 1800s, France and England fought on and off again. Finally, in the 1800s, they declared entente. And that meant, for all intents and purposes, if you invaded one country, the other country would defend it, or they certainly would not ally themselves with the offending country who had invaded them. This became, in turn, an important precondition for the alliance in World Wars I and II. That is, France and England, having fought for almost 800 years, became allies in the two greatest wars in all of history. So the proximity between the two of them, however, was absolutely a necessary condition for those on and off again wars. You have something similar in the Punic Wars, the wars between Carthage and Rome. The big kahuna, the big prize geographically between those two empires was Sicily. And if you look at a map of northern Africa where Carthage was, and the Roman Empire, which stretched from Italy to Spain, at least in the close proximity, Sicily rested right between them. Why was Sicily so important? Because it was the center of the Mediterranean stretch. So if you could control the Mediterranean, you can control military and trade routes by sea. And that close proximity between Sicily and Rome, Sicily and Carthage, became a really important factor in those wars. The last time that the close proximity between England and France was of great importance militarily, of course, was on D-Day in 1944. And so we look at the subsequent changes since the invasion of William the Conqueror, and the geography continues to be an important feature, at least through 1944. This is a temple from the 5th century. These are ruins from a temple from the 5th century BC. They rest several hundred yards below the Acropolis in Athens, and it was a temple in honor of Zeus. You'll note that these are columns, and they're not Doric or Ionic, they are Corinthian columns. So that's 2,500 years ago. We come into the 20th century, and the Supreme Court building in the United States in Washington, D.C. has Corinthian columns on its front. So this is a residue of a very important set of events. Among the things that ancient Greece gave us was tremendous architectural breakthroughs, and one of the residues we see in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere in the country are classical forms of architecture. You have Roman forms and you have Greek forms. In fact, the Supreme Court itself, the interior construct of the Supreme Court building is based on Roman pagan temples. This is a picture, obviously, right here from the state of North Carolina, the first flight in human history. 1903, the Wright brothers sent their plane up. It didn't get very far and it didn't get very high off the ground, but it was a flight. And we look at this plane and we say, by gum, that's an airplane, even if it only went 30 miles per hour. Just a few years later, we see these planes. This is a photograph from Columbus, New Mexico. In 1916, you might recall that Pancho Villa and his raiders invaded Columbus, and in response, Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time, sent General Blackjack Pershing to Columbus with a division. He brought with him a bunch of airplanes and established the very first air base in the history of the United States. We didn't have an Air Force until after, we didn't have a separate division of the military called the Air Force until after World War II. The air power was located in the Army and the Navy, and secondarily in the Marines. But these were Army airplanes, and they were brought to scout out over Chihuahua and the rest of northern Mexico in order to find Columbus. They never spotted him, and they hardly spotted any of his raiders. Most of the airplanes crashed over the desert. Why? In the desert, when flash floods come through, they create grooves called arroyos, and those arroyos in turn create strange drafts, and most of the planes were caught up in the drafts and fell. Now, I put this up here because the planes are going 79 miles per hour. That's a lot faster than the Wright brothers' plane. And the planes look different. There's a lot more wood, there's a lot more metal, there's a cockpit in which the pilot can sit upright. The length of the wings is truncated. But does it look like a plane? Yes, it does. It looks like the Wright brothers' plane. So you see there's not only consequential or subsequent events that happened since 1903, but there's a residue as well, evidence. We come into World War II. This is the Mustang, which was one of our best jets. At one point during the war, to improve the Mustang, collaboratively, the Americans adopted a Rolls-Royce engine from the Brits. It's an interesting point in World War II that the Axis powers distrusted each other so much that they never collaborated on any technology, whereas the Allies trusted each other and did collaborate, and case in point. We note that the plane is so high up that it's above the clouds, and it's going 437 miles per hour. It's all metal and fabricated plastic. The kind of cover on the cockpit is the kind of thing you'll remember from the great movie It's a Wonderful Life. Remember Sam Wainwright? Hee-haw. He made his fortune during World War II manufacturing plastic and just this kind of thing. This plane is not only going incredibly fast compared to the Wright brothers' plane, and it's so high up on the ground, it's manufactured in a radically different way. And yet, when we look at it, we say, yeah, that's a plane. There's definitely a residue of the Wright brothers' plane. We come into the 21st century, and planes are going even faster than this now, but look at this plane, almost over 1,100 miles per hour. And it looks futuristic, doesn't it, compared to the Wright brothers' plane? But does it look like a plane? Yes, it does. So we still see a residue of that enormously important eruptive event called man's first flight in 1903. That's what I mean by eruptive change, subsequent changes that brought us to where we are today, and residues of those past changes. History is a drama. How is it a drama? What do I mean by that? Human beings are born with free will. But human beings, have to be educated to freedom. That's what we mean by a liberal education. And secondly, human beings are the only creatures who choose to either fulfill their nature or fail to do so. That's why history is a drama. Things are not predetermined. Things are not set on a linear motion and just logically or necessarily progress the way they do. Human beings can choose justice or injustice, love or mercy, greatness or failing. And at any juncture in time, things can break one way or another. That's why history is a drama. During World War II, when we were preparing for the Normandy Invasion, the Allies realized that they didn't have harbors along the coast of France. They were all dominated by the Germans. So they created 2 artificial harbors. Only one of them worked, and even then it only worked moderately well, and that was at Arromanches. You see in this picture, if you look to your right, the sea is pretty choppy. But you look between the 2 sets of barriers, and the waters, especially toward the break wall to your left, is pretty calm. That's exactly what needed to happen. They needed calm waters to bring the big cargo ships in, to unload their cargo, and then truck them down these floating bridges past the wet surface of the sands that is closest to the sea. And this is how we were able to bring materiel and personnel. It's not the only way we brought personnel, but mostly it was there to bring cargo or materiel for the armed forces. And this became an important factor in the success of D-Day. Had we not done that creatively, who knows what would have happened. Here's another thing we did creatively. We successfully took the beaches at Normandy, but then immediately ran into a very difficult problem. The Norman coastline is marked by very thick hedges, and the hedges grow out of kind of raised mounds of dirt. And when our tanks tried to go across these hedges, their bellies were exposed, and the Germans were taking them out. This was the weakest part of a tank is right underneath its belly. And for a couple of weeks, the generals did not know what to do. And then a farm boy who was a sergeant came to them with an idea. He said, you'll note down on the beaches, the Germans have left these huge pieces of concave metal, which were implanted in the sand in order to stop the advancement of tanks and other armored vehicles. And so he said, this is what we should do, is we should remove them out of the sand and weld them onto the front of the tanks. And then when the tanks approach the hedges, they can, push them, just like a big, tractor, a big backhoe or something like that. That's what they did. In fact, they successfully were able to traverse those hedges. What would have happened had we not done that? Well, we don't know, but we do know that the drama of D-Day was affected by two moments of genius and creativity. Winston Churchill thought we should leave Arromanches more or less intact as an artificial harbor. And you could see the break wall still left partly intact in the back there. You can also see there's a Higgins boat. You might recognize the Higgins boat from documentaries about World War II, or perhaps from the opening of Saving Private Ryan, but they were amphibious craft that had a gate in the front that would flip open, and the soldiers or Marines would empty off that. And it was a treacherous thing to approach the beaches in Normandy, because the German pillboxes would open fire on our men. But one of the Higgins boats is there. My family and I were in Arromanches in 2017, and I was able to take my kids to look at that Higgins boat up close, and we were able to drink in the dramatic and creative past because of our forebears. On May 7th, 1945, the Nazi German Empire surrendered. Just a few years later, the Germans accepted a new constitution. That gentleman who's holding a document was the first head of government after World War II. His name is Konrad Adenauer. He was a Christian Democrat, and he was held in house arrest for most of World War II. He had been the mayor of Cologne. And Adenauer is accepting the new constitution from the parliament on this day. Now, after World War II, America sent its -- constitutional theorist over to Germany. His name was Carl Friedrich, and he was a professor of law, constitutional law at Harvard. And Friedrich had grown up in Leipzig, Germany, so he knew Germany, he knew German law, he was fluent in German. And he actually helped the Germans write the basic law of Germany. Isn't that amazing? Just a few years after Nazi Germany and America were mortal enemies, we were helping them write their constitution. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, the Imperial Japanese surrendered to the Allies. There are two officers with their backs to us that are closest to the documents table. The man to the right is General MacArthur. The man to the left is General Sutherland. He was General MacArthur's right-hand man, and his principal job at this moment was he was in charge of the surrender documents. And there were multiple copies of the surrender documents. These, off to your left, these are American Navy brass, and there were, here to the forefront are officers from the different allies, and they were all there to help witness and to co-sign the surrender documents. We were afraid that day, and this comes to the drama of the event, we were afraid that day that the Japanese would issue one more kamikaze flight. Fortunately, they did not. But there was a hiccup in the surrender documents. Each allied country had a representative who signed the document, and Canada had an officer who had been injured in World War I. He had lost sight in one eye, and his other eye was pretty shaky. And he got down to his signature line on the final copy that was going to go to the Japanese, and he misfired, and he wrote his name too low, and it kind of messed up the line of signatures that followed him from New Zealand, Australia, etc. So the Japanese protested. The gentleman there in the morning suit and top hat, he actually had a prosthesis and walked very slowly. And they knew that coming in, and they timed out the ceremony, and they had an enlisted man put tie a broomstick to his leg and then walk so, and they kind of timed out how long the ceremony would take. But he and the military representatives protested that the signatures were off, and there's no way that the surrender documents were acceptable. So Sutherland took a set of black pens, and he drew straight lines, and he had the remaining signatories re-signed the document. So because of a World War I veteran, World War II almost didn't end, but it did end from the creativity of General Sutherland. On November 3rd, 1946, the Japanese ratified their new constitution. General MacArthur and his staff were the principal authors of the Constitution. One of the provisions in the new Japanese law is that the Emperor of Japan could no longer be considered to be a god. This is the scene where the Constitution is accepted by the Emperor, and you note the posture of every member of the Parliament. Is it the case that the Japanese stopped thinking of the Emperor as a god? It's hard to tell, but at least in law, that was the case. I tell you these two stories because I think it's one of the most remarkable turnarounds in history, and it's one of the most remarkable set of dramatic moments in history. There was never a more mortal and violent and carnal war than World War II. The Imperial Japanese and the Nazi Germans were our mortal enemies, and yet they became our friends. How could that be? How could it be that we who helped conquer them turned around and helped them write laws that are very similar to our constitutions? By the early 1960s, Germany and Japan were two of our principal economic allies. Since that time, for all intents and purposes, they've been political allies. Again, one of the most remarkable, dramatic turnarounds in all of history. We celebrated the end of World War II by marching down liberated Paris. This is the Champs-Élysées, and that's the Arc de Triomphe. We mark, however, the last day in Vietnam in a very different way. April 29th, 1975, we left Saigon, and all hell broke loose. Millions of lives were lost in Vietnam as it completely turned over to the communists. Millions of lives were lost in Kampuchea or Cambodia and in Laos. Whatever you think of the Vietnam War, terrible carnal events happened subsequent to our departure. But this is how the war ended in the two respective places. Again, things can break one way or the other. If you look at the comparative gross domestic products of the United States and the Axis powers, we lapped the Axis powers. Even before the war, we would triple lap them by the end of World War II. But if you look at the comparative gross domestic products of America and Vietnam, there is no comparison. Vietnam is like a little raisin in a huge pie. It's almost not a comparison at all. And yet we won the one war and we lost the other. That's another sign of how history is dramatic. This is how we mark or memorialize World War II. This is the Iwo Jima Memorial in Arlington, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. You can see the Washington Monument in the Capitol building in the distance. This is the Vietnam Memorial, quite a different way to remember what happened. It's shaped very much like a chevron, which is a military symbol. It's also shaped like a wound, a scar. So at the middle of the memorial, it's a little bit taller than I am. At its two ends, it's just a little bit above the ground. And that's the way a wound is. A wound is widest at its middle. And it's also shaped like open arms. It's receiving everyone who's coming back from Vietnam. And all 50,000 plus lives that were lost, American lives that were lost in Vietnam, their names are carved into the wall. And it's very sober in that regard. The color is sober. It's even set below the ground. Do you know the poem by Emily Dickinson, poem 479, or I could not stop for death, so he kindly stopped for me? She speaks of a tomb that's sinking into the ground, so far into the ground, it's been there so long that the only thing you can see is the cornice top. This is something like that. The memorial itself is sort of sunk into the ground, so you could barely discern the top of the memorial when you're up on the grassy top there. But it has proven to be, it's a point of controversy, this memorial is, but it's also proven to be a great source of consolation. I have a very good friend who was a Marine in Vietnam, and I took him there. It was the first time it's the only time he's visited the memorial. He was deeply moved, and he and his wife were moved to tears, and like many veterans, put his hand on the names of men that he knew who died in battle. And he was very much appreciative of the memorial, and yet he also recognized how dark it is, how brooding it is. And in a sense, the wound of Vietnam for Americans has never actually closed. I remember in early, it was January 1980, I was a junior at university. I was studying history at the University of Notre Dame, and for the first time in the university's history, the Department of History offered a course in the history of the Vietnam War. Professor Vincent DeSantis, who was a scholar of international diplomacy, conducted the course. And he held it in the biggest classroom on the campus. It was the library auditorium, which seated about 400 persons. He let anyone who wanted to come attend the course. And you know that every seat in the house was filled, and the whole in the sideways and the middle walkway were completely jammed, and right in front of the apron of the stage were completely jammed with students. So there must have been somewhere around 600, 700 students in that room. Why? My generation was blown away. We didn't understand how it is that America, which had been 10-0, suddenly was 10-1. We didn't understand how America, which was, the glorious country that had won World War II and was arguably the greatest power in the world, had lost to this very minor power, Vietnam. We just didn't understand what had happened, but we did sense that something terrible had happened to the soul of America. And so we sat in rapt attention as he told us story after story after story. We were surprised, for example, at how corrupt our government was in handling Vietnam, and that went from mainly from JFK all the way through Nixon. We were surprised at the same time that we never lost a major battle in the war. How could we not lose a major battle in the war and still lose the war in the aggregate? For example, we thought, in the popular mind, we thought the Tet Offensive was a loss, but it was actually a victory. We were stunned that the most trusted man in America, Walter Cronkite, the anchorman of CBS News, had actually fabricated news reportage on the ground in Vietnam. This was all a shock to us. So all sorts of innocence in our 18, 19, 20-year-old psyche, all that just kind of peeled away. But it was actually very therapeutic. We kind of grew up that day. I know as a student of history, I got sober. Like I stopped thinking so romantically, and I started to look more critically, more observationally, which is not to say that I lost my love for America or lost my passion for the past or I lost any kind of gratitude for my forebears. It is to say I grew up. I started to see things more realistically. And that brings us to context. The study of history and its events has to be seen in context. And oftentimes, critics of the past, those who would divide us from our past, will try to rip the past from its context. Let me go right to arguably the most difficult part of America's past, that is slavery. Slavery, if you take it in context, which is not to diminish what happened in America, it's simply to talk about slavery as a set of historical events. Slavery goes back as far as human civilization. The oldest civilization we know of is Mesopotamia. So we're talking about 5.5 millennia ago, 3500 BC, and we have all sorts of evidence of slavery in that world. There's all sorts of evidence that slavery was part of Black African social structures. In fact, the majority of Black Africans caught and sold into slavery were caught and sold by fellow Black Africans. We know that slavery, modern slavery, hardly started with the English or the Americans. It's way before that. It started in North Africa. The Arabs enslaved sub-Saharan Africans, and there's ample evidence that. There's a wonderful monograph by Bernard Lewis, who was for many decades our greatest Arabist at Princeton University. You could look that up. The word slave comes from the word Slav. Why? Because white Slavs for several centuries were a hot market commodity in Europe, in Asia, and in Africa. Now, let's get to the hard, cruel facts. American slavery started in 1619, and it ended, depending on whether you say it ended with the Emancipation Proclamation or with the end of Civil War and the post-Civil War amendments. 12.5 million black Africans were shipped to America. 2 million of them or more died cruelly in the boats coming over. At the peak of slavery, we had more slaves than any other country in the world. There were 4 million in total. There are little glimpses of goodness or hope or positivity. The first abolitionist convention ever held was in 1775 in Philadelphia. Our Quaker forebears called for this. Did it have much of an impact? No. But after the Revolutionary War, the society that was founded in the wake of that first convocation did effect some manumissions. But their movement, the abolition movement, also kind of cornered some slaveholders and made them stick their feet firmly into the ground and say, no, we're not going to give up our slaves. It also inspired some black African slaves in America to rebel. So it didn't have a huge impact, but it had some impact, and in several ways very significantly. We're the only country in the history of the world to fight a war to end slavery. There are the early accounts of the Civil War that we lost 600,000 plus. Those numbers keep climbing because we keep finding mass graves. It's well over 700,000 now. There are more slaves today in the world than in any other time in history. You look at this map, this was from several years ago, 2016, and most of the slaves are in non-Western countries. However, the most recent reports coming out of the Global Slavery Index and the International Justice Mission indicate that slavery is on the rise again in our hemisphere through human trafficking especially. All that's to say, slavery is ubiquitous, and it's a human problem and it's an American problem. It's a human failing in every civilization in the history of the world, and it's an American failing. American liberty and American slavery were born together. It's part of our past, so we can't look away from it. But at the same time, we need to understand, because we're studying history as a liberal discipline that is proper to the humanities, that is proper to all of our humanity, we need to see it in context and not just reduce it to the American experience. History is a concept. And like the concept of being and nature, it's a concept of unity. That is a concept by which we get our arms around the whole of things. We think about nature. We have one human nature. We have one human condition. Humans have the capacity to think, to know, and we understand this is part of our nature, right? They also have the capacity to do terrible things. This is part of our nature. History helps us, as a concept, helps us get our arms around the whole of things. How so? Well, we think of the past, the present, and the future. We think about the dead, the living, and the yet to be born. So history enfolds or encompasses all or both of those trios. Here's an example. In 1776, the founders articulated self-evident truths, truths that are true everywhere. They're universal truths. That is equality, that all men are created by a creator and inherently are dignified by that creative act, and they're inherently equal each to the other. Well, in 1863, in the face of the reality of slavery, Lincoln, at the Gettysburg Address, didn't speak of self-evident truth. He spoke of propositions. Now, self-evident truths are like axioms. They don't have to be proven. They're starting points from which you derive or deduct your conclusions. But a proposition has to be proven inductively. And he said that in order to prove what the founding was about, we had to free the slaves, we had to defeat the Confederacy, we had to win the war. 100 years after the Gettysburg Address, we still had segregation in the United States. I'm one of the few people in the room old enough to remember this kind of imagery on the TV. And it really was the case that we had these kind of horrible scenes. From his jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote a letter, and he wrote a letter to those who contended with him that he shouldn't be engaged in civil disobedience. But he had an apology for that. He had an argument or a defense of it. And in order to make that argument, this is what he did. He thought in terms of unity, that is, across generations. He invoked the scriptures, Socrates, the martyrs of the church, Augustine and Aquinas. Remember, King was a Southern Baptist. He invoked Augustine and Aquinas, the two greatest minds of Catholic tradition. He invoked them. Why? Because they articulated the natural law as no one else has done since. He invoked Luther, Jefferson, a slaveholder. He didn't invoke him because he was a slaveholder. He invoked him because of what he articulated in the Declaration of Independence. He invoked Lincoln, of course. He invoked the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber and the Lutheran theologian Paul Tillich. And in invoking all of them, he put together a case that said, because segregation laws, or that is, because law is embedded in the natural law, and the natural law is embedded in the order of things all the way from the human to the divine, segregation laws, which stand opposed to the natural law, cannot be considered morally defensible. Ergo, I'm in a justifiable position to resist segregation. So he was a man who thought classically about the law, and he didn't dismiss the past because of the long history of slavery, ubiquitously evident everywhere, and most powerfully and violently evident in American history. He looked for sources of truth, goodness, and beauty. He looked for sources of unity. Unity, by the way, is a transcendental, just like truth, goodness, and beauty. And he understood that if we unite ourselves to what gives us life as opposed to what doesn't give us life, we'll find a way to circumvent or to surpass or to get over the terrors of slavery and other injustices. In his I Have a Dream speech from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, again, he unites himself to the founders, but he recognized that dramatically there's a terrible confrontation between the founding slavery on the one hand and segregation on the other. He said the founding is like a promissory note, and we got to pay it off. We got to pay it off so that everyone benefits from universal equality. Not just whites, but everyone in the country, no matter their skin color. And then he said, I have a dream that people will not be judged by their skin color, but by what? By what unites us. And what unites us? Character, love, justice, courage, self-control, self-governance, etc. This brings me to the final feature of history that we need to pay attention to, and that's the person. Sometimes you hear this, history is a force, it's marching, and we're all being dragged toward the future. Or, you've got to stand on the right side of history, and if you're on the wrong side of history, history will judge you. Here's the deal, history is not a force. History is not an agent. History has no agency. History is a habit of mind. It's a field of inquiry. It's a concept of unity. Who's the agent of history? You are. Persons are. People are. The public has memory. You have memory. Memory is the place where we collect what we know and love. That's what the person is. And in turn, what we know and love, most importantly, is that we as persons are responsible for one another. That is, we carry in ourselves other persons. A mother carries her child. A soldier carries his fellow soldier. A teacher carries his students. A pastor carries his flock. Someone in an emergency unit carries the people who are in distress. This is what we do as human beings. We carry one another. This is what it means to be a person. Now, the word person derives from a Greek term, prosopon. And what it means literally is the mask that the actor wore. This is very interesting. When the Greeks went on stage, they didn't let the actors' faces be known to the audience. Rather, what mediated between the audience and the actor was a mask, the prosopon, the person. So this actor in a modern version of Oedipus Rex, puts on the mask of King Oedipus, and the mask mediates between the audience and himself. That's the nub, that's the kernel of what it means to be a person, is that you mediate between others. You carry in yourself something that others have to see. Here's another sensibility. This is arguably the most famous icon in all of Christian history. It's called the Christ Pantocrator. And if you look at it closely, remember in Christian theology or Christian doctrine, the conviction is there that Christ is both God and human. If you look closely at this icon, to your left, the face of Christ is very smooth. The eye is perfectly open. Excuse me. On the other side, on your right, his face is slightly marred and darkened, and his eye is slightly closed. So the left side is supposed to represent, that is, let's call it his right side, is supposed to represent his divinity. His left side is supposed to represent his humanity. But here's the deal. We cannot contemplate the divinity of Christ except through his humanity. That is, the person of Christ mediates between God and all humankind. That's what the incarnation means. That's what the icon represents. The abolition movement was going great guns in England. Every argument against abolition was successfully on the table, but strangely, the Brits could not push over the top legislation to abolish slavery once and for all. You know what happened? Is in the shop or the studio of Wedgwood, they created a medallion, and on the medallion was a black African slave on his knee in chains. And there were two questions posed to the viewer of the medallion. One is, am I not a man? And the other is, am I not your brother? Now, the first question is a humanist question. The second question is a biblical question. That is, the language of universal brotherhood is a biblical contribution. But the language of thinking about all of us as, humans is kind of a humanist or enlightenment contribution. And weirdly, the abolition movement is a convergence of the Enlightenment, which is much maligned by all sorts of people, including Christians today, and Quaker and evangelical Christianity. The key, however, so this is a moment of drama. It's like, if it wasn't for the Quakers and the evangelicals, the abolition movement there was no other force to be the catalyst for the abolition movement. But because those people courageously took up the cause to abolish slavery, it happened. But then artists created something that mediated between the British public and those who could do something about it. And it's the black African slave. It's his humanity, and it's his intrinsic brotherhood with everybody in the room that says, we've got to outlaw slavery. That's what it means to be a person, to mediate between everyone else and those who can do something about it. His humanity is the mediating force. I'll give you one more example. This is a painting called the White Crucifixion. In 1938, on a terrible night in Germany, the Nazi government unleashed what's called Kristallnacht. In every major city in Germany, brown shirts went out and they set synagogues on fire. They damaged Jewish homes, Jewish businesses, Jewish schools. And it's called Kristallnacht because it's the night of broken glass. That is, they broke the windows and set places on fire. A few weeks later, a Jewish painter who was born in Belarus, Marc Chagall, was living in Paris. He caught wind of the event and he painted this painting called the White Crucifixion. Now, obviously, the central subject is the person of Jesus. But the thing is, this particular rendering of Jesus is not a Christian rendering. It's a Jewish rendering. Let me explain how. First of all, you look at the head covering on Jesus. It's not a crown of thorns. It's a traditional Jewish headcloth. Every Orthodox Jewish man keeps his head covered. Even in death, they cover his head as a matter of piety and reverence. If you look, typically, historically, there was no loincloth on the victim of a crucifixion. But historically, out of reverence, Christian artists depict Jesus on the cross with a loincloth. This is not a loincloth, it's called a teleth, which is a rabbi's prayer shawl. Now, every Orthodox Jewish man would have a prayer shawl, and the tassels it would be underneath his cloak or his shirt, and the tassels would dangle out, and you could see that. So Chagall has not only depicted Jesus as a Jew, he's depicted him as a rabbi. At the foot of the cross, there's a menorah, which in Jewish history, Jewish tradition, is a set of candles that are a sign of hope. It's a diminished menorah. It's missing one of the candles. Like all the other Jewish symbols here, there's something that's been taken away. If you make your way around, and above his head, now historically we know that the name Jesus Christ, King of the Jews, was written in 3 languages. Here is only the initials are in Latin, and then the whole thing is written out only in Hebrew, in Aramaic using Hebrew letters. Then all around Jesus are Jews in diaspora or being persecuted somehow. Down here in the corner, we see an old Jewish man in the blue cloak. His hat's been taken away, which is a sign of irreverence. Again, an Orthodox Jewish man would always keep his head covered. And he's wearing a sign. Now, in the painting, Chagall chose not to write anything on the sign, but in the drawings leading up to the painting, he wrote "Ich bin Jude," which means "I am a Jew." And you know that either a yellow Star of David or a sign that says "I am a Jew" would be affixed to a Jewish person in order to identify them, and that was usually an occasion for bullying, for persecution of various kinds. There's the man right behind him is carrying the Torah, and he's clearly moving away from someone chasing after him. So he's taken the sacred scrolls, the sacred scriptures away from the synagogue. Down in the corner, there's a man distressed, and in the same color across the bottom there's a woman holding a baby. This is depicting a family that's been separated, and the assault on Jews all throughout the Holocaust, in no small measure, separated family members. We move up to the boat, and there's a group of Jews trying to push away from the coastline. Someone's chasing them. They're trying to get away. Above them is a traditional Russian village called a shtetl. You remember in the movie Fiddler on the Roof, Anatevia was the little village where they all lived, and the Tsar would order, upending, burning of their little huts. And in the movie, they upended a beautiful marriage ceremony. But this shtetl is the kind of village that Chagall grew up in. And in Russian society, they would organize all the Jews off in a little ghetto, and it would be called a shtetl. This one's on fire. Above them, there was a group of men. They had red flags. This is evocative of Russia. Now, the Jews were persecuted by the Tsar. They were later persecuted under the communists. Chagall himself had sympathies to the Russian Revolution, and then he lost his sympathies. Making your way to the top, these are spirits or ghosts of Jewish forebears, and they're grieving the persecution of their descendants. Across the way then you see a synagogue that's been lit on fire. Above it is a flag, and it's in the colors of the German flag. And below it is a man in a brown shirt and a fiery red face. He's a brown shirt, a Nazi brown shirt. And he set the synagogue on fire. And then making your way down below him, there's a man in green. This is a figure from Jewish literature called the Wandering Jew. He's also identified with the prophet, I'm blanking on it. The prophet who will proclaim the Messiah. But he is not moving toward the Messiah. He's moving away from the Messiah. He also is always depicted with a sack for travel and a traveling staff, and his staff has been taken away. All this is to say that this is all a depiction of suffering Jews, and the central suffering Jew is Jesus. He's been placed in a circle of suffering Jews. So the persecution of the Jews by the Romans in antiquity has been dragged into the modern world and placed at the center of the middle of the 20th century persecution of the Jews. Is it hopeless? I don't think so. If for no other reason, you had that shaft of heavenly light. It's descending from heaven. Interestingly, it's the same color as the headdress on Jesus. It's the same color of the linens that would be wrapped around the body of a deceased Jewish loved one. That's how they would bury someone. But Jesus and the cross have been bathed, have been caught up or encompassed by heavenly light. So it seems like there's some kind of sign of hope. But in terms of the person, I think this is what we're supposed to take away. Chagall has painted a Jewish depiction of Jesus. Jesus is the most oft depicted human subject in the history of art. He's the most famous Christian. He's the most famous Jew. He's the most famous Westerner. He's the most famous person in all of history. And he's placed him at the center of suffering Jews. Why? Because the person of Jesus is mediating between all those who are suffering in the 1930s and the 1940s, in the Holocaust, and the rest of us who could do something about it. If you look to his left or to your right, there's a deposition ladder. In most depictions of the cross in Christian art, a deposition ladder is used to send somebody up to bring Jesus down. There is no one on the ladder. And Chagall is asking the rest of us who will take Jesus down from the cross, and radiating out to the rest of the Jews who will alleviate the suffering of our Jewish neighbors. The great historian and theologian at Yale, Jaroslav Pelikan, says this of this painting. It's startling, isn't it, that Jesus is depicted as a Jew on the cross in the middle of Christian civilization. But here's the deal. Precisely because Jesus belonged to the Hebrew people, he could belong to the Christian church. And precisely because the person of Jesus belongs to the Christian church, he could belong to the world. That's what it means to be a person. And we remember a very important line from the Talmud, which is the beginning of the Hebrew scriptures. The line goes like this: if you save a life, you save the world. And the reality is, Jesus, in this picture, Chagall, through his painting, is telling us that the person mediates between the rest of us. He's at the center of history. He's both the object and the agent of history. And that's my final feature of history. Thank you, everyone.